As I always say, it's all about Enlightenment ideas of reason, science, individualism, living this life here on Earth. Now, the right, the conservatives, they're motivated by pre-Enlightenment ideas. And the left, the skeptics, they're motivated by anti-Enlightenment ideas. I have been getting more requests to look at John Doyle. Last week, I did a rebuttal to John Doyle upon requests, multiple requests. But ever since last week even, I've gotten more requests to look at this specific video of John Doyle called Exposing the Suppressed Truth About Individualism and Collectivism. You can see this was just uploaded the other day, already has 38,000 views, will probably get a lot more. But I actually want to start toward the end of the video because he says something that I've been stressing a lot. You guys probably already know what's coming. Let's see what he says at the end. And then we're going to go back to the beginning.
By John Doyle. Seriously.
Hold on. I got to slow it down.
This is the divide.
This is the divide.
Militantly self-expressive versus the self-dedicating. And that's why if you look at the divide in this country, it's not like issues of economics. It's about issues of sovereignty, about morality, about identity, and about...
Did he just say that it's not about economics? What have I been telling you guys? It's not about economics. And you can see this playing out this week. It's late October 2021. There's a port debacle in California due to supply chain disruptions. We can talk about the causes of those. I plan on maybe making a video about this topic. I'm trying to get more information on it. But, you know, there's a port debacle. People are not getting goods that they want, that they order. And what's the attitude? What's the response? People that write for The Atlantic, they're saying supply chain problems could be solved more quickly if affluent Americans would stop buying up things they don't need and often don't really want.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
Then we got Ginger Z, who is a meteorologist for ABC News. Over 2 million followers on Twitter. Says, likely unpopular opinion regarding the supply chain discussion. What can shoppers do? Reduce consumption. Our obsession with multiple gifts, especially for kids, is beyond what's necessary. Does anybody really need more gifts? So many opportunities here to have bigger discussions. Support local, shop small, and less.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
And then we have White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. In response to questions about the port debacle, she dismissed it as the tragedy of the treadmill that's delayed.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
So, do you hear that, folks? How dare you expect your political leadership to make it easier for you to order goods, which is actually one of the proper roles of the federal government, is to establish trade deals and make international trade more smoothly. How dare you expect them to make that easier? The real problem is you guys. The real problem is you guys. You guys need to shop less. This is a common theme amongst Democrats. If their ridiculous economic policies ever result in destruction, which they have to do, and then once they do it, then they say, well, they tell you to make sacrifices. They immediately pivot to ordering you to make sacrifices.
No surprise there.
Anyway, let's go back to John Doyle. Let's start this at about 20 seconds in. But remember, it's not about economics.
Overlook anyways, especially within the context of political discourse and political solutions. And that is simply the way we go about solving problems, because obviously what we're doing now is not exactly working, and the frustration is always, well, we're just not doing it correctly. That wasn't real conservatism, literally identical to, well, that wasn't real communism. And what this neglects to take into account is simply the possibility that perhaps many of the presuppositions upon which our entire movement or ideology is built are just false, just plain wrong. And obviously, if your foundation is unstable, if it's incorrect, you're never going to get anywhere. Like the house of cards will just keep collapsing, the same way that if you were trying to solve an equation with incorrect or inaccurate values, it just would never compute, because thinking reasonably with unreasonable or incorrect presuppositions will always lead away from the truth. Obviously, it's going to lead away from the correct solution and instead lead into confusion or incorrect answers. And I'll give you an example. Right off the bat, let's put the end caps on suicide watch. Right now, we are in a position where there are transnational megacorporations that have more power than the state. These corporations...
All right, he's already saying that corporations have more power than the state. You often see this. You actually see it more on the left, but you see the more populists on the right are embracing this notion. They conflate economic power with political power. It's a common conflation, but is that true? Do corporations really? You could say they have more influence, more economic power, but do they have more political power? I mean, we even have Janet Yellen and others arguing that we should give the IRS more resources. Elizabeth Warren has been saying this for years. The IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, they need more resources. Robespierre Reich talked about in a video he recently did about how horrible it is that the IRS is underfunded. But then you have Janet Yellen saying that that the IRS, that they should have requirements on banks that require banks to report accounts that make over $600 a year in transactions, and they try to justify this, saying, "Oh, we're just doing this to hold the billionaires accountable."
Blow it out your ass.
And is that the case? Who do you guys think is more likely to get a friendly letter from the IRS after this new requirement goes through? Do you think a billionaire, maybe other high-income earners who have the means, probably spend the money on good accountants, good professionals to ensure that they pay the least amount of taxes legally possible? Do you think they're more likely to get a friendly letter from the IRS? Or do you think it's going to be, the average, everyday Americans, many of whom probably don't even file taxes, but many of the ones that do, probably try to figure their shit out at the last minute, the week before the deadline, using some free version of TurboTax or whatever? Who do you think's more likely to get a friendly letter from the IRS? Which, as we know, if you don't respond to that friendly letter, if you don't pay them the money that they say you owe, we all know that you're going to jail. I guess in all fairness, talking about political power, economic power, and getting letters in the mail, I guess in all fairness, I probably do get a lot more letters from giant corporations begging me for money, begging me for my money in exchange for their goods and services, begging me to buy their products, which I usually just throw in the garbage without a second thought. Now, I don't have the same comforts. Whenever I get a traffic notice in the mail or a tax notice from LA County in the mail, I wonder why I don't have the same level of comfort. It's a total mystery.
Are run by woke oligarchs who want to and do successfully profit from the degeneration of our society. They also largely have control over our government so as to destroy small businesses, perspective for actual competition, etc. Sometimes this is what's referred to as state capitalism or corporatism, or in other words,
I would say it's cronyism, mixed economy, which, creates a perpetual state of pressure group warfare.
Not true capitalism. So why does this happen in the first place? Well, because as the ANCAP will happily tell you, businesses have an incentive to maximize market share and profits, all that good stuff. And the logical consequence of a corporation gaining enough wealth and market share to where it's more powerful than the state is simply for it to weaponize the state by buying it so as to maintain that position of wealth and power. This is exactly what's happened.
I would say it's more of a result of just people not believing in freedom Whether or not that manifests itself in big businesses and large corporations seeking political power for monetary gain to lock out their competition, or if it manifests itself in the so-called little guy trying to do the same thing in the name of antitrust or the name of union power grabs or whatever, is irrelevant.
Now, so what's the solution? Well, just go back to the free market so it can happen again. Like, how are you even going to do that in the first place when now the elites own your government? You're not. The natural cycle of total free market capitalism has progressed in front of our very eyes, and we are confused by this because we've been...
Yeah, so the natural cycle of free market capitalism, it just naturally leads to this part of statism. Where have I heard that before?
No offense, but it sounds like some fucking commie gobbledygook.
Spoon-fed decades of capitalism equals good propaganda, and it is. No one's saying it's not. No one is making the argument that, like, markets are inefficient. This is simply an indictment of the idea of capitalism purely for capitalism's sake, of amoral markets, that because of man's flawed nature will always devolve into the current state. Plus,
now, he is onto a point. I talked about this in my rebuttal to Lauren Southern in her video about capitalism and how you need more than just an economic system. But this, he mentions man's flawed nature will devolve into this current state. This touches on something I've said before. I talk about this in my video, Why Socialism Won't Go Away. And that the arguments against freedom and capitalism ultimately come from a low view of man. That people don't believe in capitalism because us dumb, depraved humans, we don't know how to behave in a free society. And if altruism is the moral standard, which is Mr. Doyle's moral standard, then of course you're going to have a low view of man. You're going to not trust people to live free. And this is why, for people like Mr. Doyle, freedom comes with a caveat. The caveat of people have to go to church, people have to embrace religion, otherwise you get chaos.
The state of technology, everything being so connected, everything being so centralized, this is just inevitable. Oh, well, monopolies can only be created by the state. Yeah, maybe that was true like 150 years ago.
I mean, it's still true.
Not anymore. We're not talking about steel and rubber anymore or whatever. Like, the idea is only true in the abstract, on paper. Nowadays, the only thing that could prevent a monopoly is the state, if its allegiance were, to small businesses and to the American people, but it isn't because it's been bought out by the elite class because there's such a huge disparity between the power of these corporations and the power of the state.
All this talk about monopolies, it's interesting because I saw this tweet recently from Tom Gardner, who I guess writes for the Motley Fool. Not someone I follow, but I thought this was an interesting tweet. He talked about the 10 biggest company, listed the 10 biggest companies by market cap in 2001. And then he listed the 10 biggest companies by market cap today. And you notice how there's a lot of differences. I think the only company that appears in both is Microsoft. But I find this interesting because Walmart is not even in the top 10 anymore. Back in the early to mid 2000s, everyone was shrieking about Microsoft and Walmart, especially Walmart, but Microsoft was getting hit up for antitrust left and right. People were shrieking about Microsoft taking over. People were shrieking about Walmart becoming this big, scary monopoly. Woo! And now they're not even in the top 10 anymore. Microsoft, you could say, well, they're still in the top 10. They're number 2. But when you think of all these, supposed big tech monopolies, does Microsoft even come in the top 5? You probably think of Alphabet, Google, which wasn't even in the top 10 back then. You definitely think Amazon. You definitely think Facebook, Google, Amazon, Facebook, probably Apple. When you think big tech monopolies, Twitter probably comes to mind before Microsoft. Netflix probably comes to mind before Microsoft. Speaking of Netflix being a big... they weren't even top 10 20 years ago. But speaking of Netflix, you know who is a big scary monopoly 20 years ago was a company called Blockbuster Video. Who now they get mocked for not buying Netflix. Like, oh, dumb Blockbuster should have bought Netflix back then. Blockbuster apparently tried to buy other companies like Hollywood Video, which the Federal Trade Commission stopped, and people were cheering this on because Blockbuster, they're already a big, scary monopoly. They already have so much market share. Do we really want them buying companies like Hollywood Video? And now Blockbuster isn't even around anymore. There's like one location in the United States. You know, all this fear mongering about monopolies.
And it's funny too, because anarcho-capitalists will try to appear reasonable by saying, well, we're not saying it's a perfect system. Obviously, everything has flaws. Hey, here's a flaw. Well, no, because that's not actually true capitalism.
I would say that that a fundamental flaw with the ANCRAPs is that they want to abolish the state altogether, which I think is worse than the modern mixed economy. But I'm going to jump ahead to about 7 minutes here, 7.5.
With an emotional response, that is because of propaganda. That is because these people hold focus groups, they run tests, and they analyze literally how to manipulate people's emotions to get them to support certain ideas and causes. So if you hear me say the word collectivism, for example, you might think, oh yeah, no, I don't agree with that. But if you go, what? This is what the fascist communists did. This is 1984 all over again. That is because you are the unwitting victim of a psychological operation.
I mean, the fascists and the communists were collectivists.
My pity. It's literally just like the 2 Minutes Hate from 1984. That's the response. Totally akin, by the way, to Orange Man bad, madrumph. But that being said, please don't get the impression that I'm a collectivist or something. I'm not. I don't want to share property. I want freedom. I want to be left alone. But
yeah, he's not a collectivist. He just wants to be left alone. That's good to know.
I also fundamentally reject this concept of individualism that we've all been sold because it's been a disaster for the human race. And I think
individualism, it's been a disaster for the human race.
You'll find yourself with me there if you hear me out. But first, hear me out.
But first, he has to sell us some underwear, so I'm going to jump ahead to 9:30.
All right, how do I want to do this? We're going to start with World War II. We'll jump back to the founding era. We'll tie it all together. So basically, the post-World War II intellectual trends have proven to be the final nail in the coffin, and each decade has been just an additional strike from the hammer. And because hindsight's 20/20, it's easy for us now to look back and see how this was basically inevitable, but regardless, the people who lived through the two world wars saw death and destruction on an incomprehensible scale, something that you and I just couldn't understand. And so the thoughts after World War II, understandably, were, okay, how do we make sure that something like this never happens again? And basically what was decided and promoted by people like Karl Popper, who wrote a book titled The Open Society and Its Enemies, which, by the way, inspired the Open Society Foundation, which of course belongs to George Soros, just in case you still think these ideas are on our side. But the idea was basically that in order to avoid authoritarianism and in order to avoid great conflict, society must be anti-metaphysical. And metaphysics is just a fancy word for how we know things, basically. And so to be anti-metaphysical means not just that you don't know things, but that you can't know things.
So his issue
before on the channel, and I had
so his issue is that people like Karl Popper, they said that you can't know things.
Physical. And metaphysics is just a fancy word for how in order to avoid great conflict, society must be anti-metaphysical. And metaphysics is just a fancy word for how we know things, basically. And so to be anti-metaphysical means not just that you don't know things, but that you can't know things. And we've talked about this before on the channel, and I had some people saying, well, I think you mean epistemology instead of metaphysics. And I understand the confusion, but I don't mean that at all. Because epistemology deals with knowledge and justified belief. I mean that it was anti-metaphysical because it rejected outright the concepts of truth and reality, which is what metaphysics is. But anyways, and this would be more of the epistemology of it, they said that the only things that you can know are the things that you can prove empirically and that you could potentially disprove empirically as well. And this was called falsification. And
so Doyle sounds confused on what's metaphysics and what's epistemology. Metaphysics deals with existence. Epistemology deals with knowledge. And I think this confusion is somewhat besides the point because for him, the issue is that thinkers like Karl Popper in the Open Society, I guess, essentially said that you can't know things. That you can't know things. And this is something that Harry Binswanger mentions in his book, How We Know. He mentions Popper, the contemporary attack on science by Popper, Kuhn, and Firebend is grounded in Kantianism. In their postmodern version of Kant, science deals not in truth, but in public relations. He talks about this. Binswanger talks about this. When talking about Kant, how Kant synthesized Plato with Descartes with a skeptical twist from Hume. And how this is all part of Kant's mission to separate the mind from reality, a part of Kant's attack on reason, that you can't know things.
That's just not smart.
So all this talk about Popper, it sounds in line with Kant, and I'm going to skip ahead to about 12 minutes because he talks a lot about Karl Popper, and I don't know enough nor care to squabble over what Popper and the open society really meant.
This thinking has corrupted modern conservatism to where we think that we either exist as the individual or the collective.
Well, you do exist as an individual.
And the collective means 1984. We don't like that. But the truth is that there's no such thing as the individual, which is a liberal idea, by the way. But that doesn't mean that you don't have individual rights. Of course you do. And that doesn't mean that you can't.
Okay, so this is funny. He says that the individual does not exist. It's a liberal idea.
But the truth is that there's no such thing as the individual, which is a liberal idea, by the way. But that doesn't mean that you don't have individual rights. Of course you do.
How can one have individual rights if the individual does not exist?
That's just not smart.
You can't live your life as you please. Of course you can. But from the moment that you are born, you are defined not as an individual, but as a son or as a daughter, and then maybe a brother or a sister, an American, a mentor, whatever. At no point do you ever exist as an individual. No man is an island. You're
No man is an island.
really not that special because
You're
you
not that special.
rely on other people and people rely on you.
You rely on others and others rely on you.
And it's that interdependence and cohesion upheld through a common culture that is the foundation of a prosperous and flourishing society.
So this is a classic common straw man I see against individualism. I should probably start, what is individualism? Individualism is the recognition that every person is an independent, sovereign entity capable of reason, capable of rational thought, which they should use to guide their behavior. Every individual is responsible for their own behavior, their own actions, and that society should be organized around this fact, that where every individual lives in peaceful coexistence with other members of society, because society is merely a collection of individuals.
You're goddamn right.
And Doyle seems to agree that you have individual rights and that he himself doesn't want to share his property. He's not a collectivist, but also individuals don't exist. Why? Because when you come into this world, you come into this world as someone's son, someone's daughter. And I say, so what? This does not change anything. This doesn't change the fact that you're an individual. Classifications like son, daughter, I think he mentioned brother, sister, American. These are just identifications with your relationship to other people. This does not change the fact that you're an individual. Otherwise, why would your parents give you a fucking name to begin with? And I see this a lot. People think individualism just means being your own island, isolated from everyone else. Not at all. Not at all. I love living in a civilized society. I think any rational person would. I don't think anyone wants to live like Tom Hanks' character in the movie Castaway, or live like Matt Damon's character in The Martian. You know, that's a miserable existence. You know, you rely on others, others rely on you. Yes, and in a social context, I get to decide who I get to deal with, who I get to trade with, interact with, through my own decisions and voluntary cooperation.
Now, that being said, there's no such thing as the collective either. It's been tried before, fails every time because it defies the...
So there's no such thing as the individual or the collective, although he's right on the collective. All collectives are completely arbitrary.
Natural proclivities of human nature. My point is that there's actually a balance between individualism and collectivism that is necessary to live in a stable, free society. Because if you only focus on individualism, like we've been doing for the last 100...
So I find it odd that he rejects both concepts. He says the individual exists and the collective does not exist, yet he thinks we should have a proper balance of both.
That's just not smart.
How can you balance two things that don't exist?
You know, that's a really good question.
And what is the proper balance exactly? You know, you see this a lot from these new common good conservative intellectuals like Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermelli. Last week, the Pope talked a lot about how politicians should focus on common good.
Blow it out your ass.
Do these conservatives not realize that this is what gives the communists and all of the other collectivists on the left the opening that they need to take over? Because the collectivists on the left, they want to steal your car, and they try to justify it by saying they just want to give it to someone who lacks a means of transportation. And instead of saying, heck off, commie, this is my car, conservatives, they want to, with their healthy balance of individualism and collectivism, they say stuff like, well, that's compromise. You can have my car for maybe 3 days out of the week. And then, 2 months later, the commies come back asking for more days for the car.
100 years, then there's nothing left to unify people in the society. There's no language, there's no culture, no religion, no shared value framework. The only thing that we have in common is that we have nothing in common, but it's okay because we're all individuals.
Yeah, so we the only thing that unifies us is that we don't have anything in common. Why can't the love of life and freedom unite everyone? People are going to have a different hierarchy of values. So what? This person over here is a vegan. This person over here likes to eat barbecue. And what if one day both of their property and lives are under the attack of kamikaze pilots? Can they unify in eliminating such threats? What if this person over here, they're in a heavy metal band. This person over here is a journalist. That person over there is a stand-up comedian. Person behind me is a porn star. Can they unify? Can they come together and be united under their love for the First Amendment because their lives and their careers, their professions might be in jeopardy without such free speech protections? Even apply this to religion. Can say a Christian, an atheist, a Jew, and whoever, can they unite under their love for freedom of religion despite their religious differences? In fact, there was earlier this year, there was a History Channel, there was a series on the History Channel called The Titans Who Built America, and there was an entire episode about how all of the business leaders in America, some of whom had been competing with each other ruthlessly for decades, some for years, how when the war started, they all put their differences aside and they came together and they worked together for the war effort in World War II. Likewise, I think this is why a lot of clueless jackals in the media and in America are dumbfounded when so many Americans hate Antifa. They say, they're just anti-fascists. What's wrong with being anti-fascist?
Blow it out your ass.
Yeah, I'm anti-fascist, but when it comes clear that the two obvious goals, the two obvious end goals promoted by many of these so-called anti-fascists are either anarchy or communism, don't be surprised when you lose sympathy from a lot of good people.
And you look outside and everything is on fire, society is totally destabilized, and then the government overcorrects for that, and that's when you get your collectivism. That's when you get your big government, which is what we're experiencing right now.
I would say, the collectivism comes first. Government overcorrects because the culture has embraced collectivism or some healthy balance of collectivism and individualism, which is just really diet collectivism, but the culture puts these politicians in power, and then these collectivist politicians, then resort to collectivism and authoritarianism the minute they see a fire.
Because it turns out that you can't actually tell people that to care about things like nation and culture is archaic and uneducated, that to be a somewhere, a hometown boy instead of an anywhere, a member of the laptop class is lesser than. And we'll get into that more in a second, but you can't expect a century of post-war intellectualism to conquer human nature. You just can't. So that's basically the intellectual part.
It's the intellectual part.
Now there's the authoritarian part, which was basically, okay, how do we stop people from thinking that they get to declare something to be true? So a bunch of sociologists got together at UC Berkeley, many of them members of the Frankfurt School, which was a group of Marxist intellectuals who fled to America during World War II, and they published a work called The Authoritarian Personality, and it sought to answer two questions. Firstly, what makes a person a potential fascist? And secondly, how can we prevent people in the United States from being socialized into that mindset? So they go through a bunch of charts and interviews and correlations, and a lot of it depends upon one of the Freudian theories of psychological development that has now just been totally discredited. The survey questions are totally biased. The work itself is tremendously flawed from the standpoint of methodology. But what's alarming is that their conclusion was that the potential fascist is an American who was raised in a hierarchical family that supports a dichotomous understanding and conception of right versus wrong and man versus woman, which means that if you were raised in a relatively normal American family, you were taught right from wrong, and that men are men and women are women, congratulations, you're a potential fascist. And we can laugh about that, but the publication ends with the author saying that there's not much that can be done about the adults who manifest authoritarian personalities, and so attention must be
Slow down now.
turned to children. And social scientists must work to teach children values of egalitarianism, democracy, subjectivism, openness, etc., because that is the only way to prevent authoritarianism and great conflict. Sounds great, but here we are now living under increasing authoritarianism.
Now, there is some truth to this. I think Mr. Doyle oversimplifies it by focusing too much on the Frankfurt School, but this is talked about in the book Cynical Theories, where it talks about how postmodernism, while difficult to define, perhaps by design, it represents a set of ideas and modes of thought that came together in response to specific historical conditions, including the cultural impact of the world wars and how these ended. Widespread disillusionment with Marxism, the waning credibility of religious worldviews in post-industrial settings, and the rapid advance of technology. Goes on to say this new kind of radical skepticism to the very possibility of obtaining objective knowledge has since rippled outward from the academy to challenge our social, cultural, and political thinking in intentionally disruptive ways. And even Leonard Peikoff kind of mentions this in the dim hypothesis. He says, in the decades after World War II, a new approach became increasingly evident on the ethical political scene, egalitarianism, which for the first time had made explicit an idea implicit in Western thought, notably in the teachings of Christianity, Kant, and Marx. So yeah, many of the post-war intellectuals, especially in the humanities departments at universities, were radical skeptics in one form or another. But keep all of that in mind. I'm going to come back to that. Let's jump ahead to 22 and a half.
Figured it out, didn't you? Here's something no one talks about anymore, but is nonetheless true. The founding fathers would be appalled to see what their country has devolved into, but not for the reasons that people so often talk about. Not because of the Department of Transportation or whatever, but because people used to raise families. They used to buy property. They used to go to church. And of course, hindsight—
They used to go to church.
Is 2020, but these concepts of limited government, states' rights, these concepts which we now pretend are our golden ticket back to when America was great, those all presuppose relativism. They presuppose individualism. They presuppose the power vacuum, right? They make no serious declaration as to how things ought to be, but instead declare that we should minimize the ability of anyone to say or enforce how things ought to be.
I mean, I would say they were pretty clear. The founding fathers were pretty clear in what they were declaring with the Declaration of Independence, which a lot of people excuse whenever you bring it up. Well, that's not actually legally binding.
Well, excuse me, princess.
Excuse me. It only laid out the principles that the founders were seeking to establish a new country on.
Be in society. And the reason that was done is because the social institutions in this country were basically taken for granted. And so it was thought that government should be structured such that it couldn't interfere with them. This is why separation of church and state is incorrectly understood, and what it was actually intended to be was a separation of church from state, so that the state couldn't interfere with the church, because the church in this—
It was a two-way street, because if the church interferes with the state and gets control over the state, what do you think is going to happen? You saw this a lot in the 17th century during the English Civil Wars and throughout history.
Country until somewhat recently, actually, it was a more powerful institution than the government, and that was a good thing, and they wanted to keep it that way. But the problem is that framework of government is only sustainable with those social institutions in place. That's why the founders said that the Constitution was written for a moral and religious people, and that there's no way it would function in any other society. That is not ambiguous. They are talking about Christianity. They are talking about piety.
They are talking about Christianity, you guys. They are talking about Christianity. According to the autobiography of Thomas Jefferson, the bill for establishing religious freedom, the principles of which had to a certain degree been enacted before, I had drawn in all the latitude of reason and right. It still met with opposition, but with some mutilations in the preamble, it was finally passed, and a single proposition proved that its protection of opinion was meant to be universal. Where the preamble declares that coercion is a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, an amendment was proposed by inserting the word Jesus Christ so that it should read a departure from the plan of Jesus Christ, the holy author of our religion. The insertion was rejected by a great majority in proof that they meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, which I think means Muslim, and the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. Jefferson himself was often a critic of religion, as was Thomas Paine. Founders like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington had respect for non-Christian religions. So this notion that America was meant just for Christians is false.
And this is inconvenient to a lot of so-called conservatives nowadays because they just want to continue to define freedom as the freedom to pursue their preferred method of self-destruction because they're addicted to vice and they're too weak to realize or do anything about that. And this is what the libertarians get wrong because their whole concept of the NAP, the non-aggression principle, it's the brainchild of the harm principle from John Stuart Mill, one of the founding thinkers of liberalism, individualism, etc. But if you read what he actually wrote, it wasn't just that he wanted government to stay out of his business and for people to not steal his property. No, he was actually against the whole concept of social laws, even more so than institutional laws, because he recognized that they were often more powerful in terms of compelling individual behavior. So in other words, even the founding thinkers of liberalism wanted an amoral society.
Wanted an amoral society.
They wanted the power vacuum. They wanted the
power vacuum.
abolition of social institutions because those inherently set standards as to how society should conduct itself, which, if you can't tell by now, is wholly unsustainable because
So yeah, there's a lot to be said about morals and institutions. But again, I say the solution is not religion, because religion, particularly Christianity, is a primitive form of philosophy that is ultimately focused on following orders from some higher all-knowing being and looking forward to the afterlife. And you can maybe say that churches and religions maybe served a purpose when intellectual leadership was struggling to answer difficult moral questions on secular grounds, when communities found it easier to come together and organize around institutions of faith. Although even at the time, people like Benjamin Franklin, they were creating civic organizations that had nothing to do with religion, that were not grounded in faith or religion. I mean, you see it today with corporations. Corporate people or individuals coming together to seek a profit while trying to minimize risk and liability. We don't need religion anymore, and God is not real anyway, so it's ridiculous to organize society around God. And on top of that, we have a secular, fully integrated philosophy that provides a foundation to answer questions of epistemology, of ethics, of politics, that is in line with the founding principles of reason, individualism, and freedom.
here's what happens. Oftentimes we get locked into this false dichotomy of individualism versus collectivism. We think it's like this tug of war between individual
Slow it down again.
and collective, and even if there's some overlap or compromise between the two, that's just like the rope not yet crossing either of the lines during the struggle. This is not the case. To reiterate, I don't like collectivism. I like unity. There's a difference. We used to have unity. Now we have collectivism. And unity is not what leads to collectivism. In fact, unity...
Yeah, and I don't like collectivism. I like unity. There's a difference. He's right. He's right. But and I agree with his definition of collectivism, that collectivism is subordinating the individual to the collective. And it's usually enforced by some state, by some government. But he says, I want unity. I like unity. But unity under what exactly?
We used to have unity. Now we have collectivism. And unity is not what leads to collectivism. In fact, unity is the only thing that can resist collectivism, because collectivism is enforced by the state, which would be impossible if the people were unified. But what actually leads to collectivism is individualism, and I will explain why right now. But just keep that in mind, that individualism, properly understood, is simply the preceding stage of decline before collectivism.
Now, he's actually right if we're using his definition of individualism, which again he packages with skepticism, subjectivism, and all the other nonsense on the left. The problem is his definition of individualism is incorrect.
Because collectivism does not oppose individualism. It actually requires it. Think about it. Organic unity between people occurs through family, through community, through church, through nation, etc.
Through church, through nations.
This is the backbone of every healthy society.
So essentially he thinks unity under God. I know he keeps trying to invoke the founding fathers and paying lip service to individual rights here and there, and he invokes family and nation, but you only get the freedom and individual rights if you first accept God. Ultimately, he thinks unity comes from under God, and this goes back to what I said earlier about the intellectuals, the post-war intellectuals.
About the adults who manifest authoritarian personalities. And so attention must be turned to children. And social scientists must work to teach children values of egalitarianism, democracy, subjectivism, openness, etc., because that is the only way to prevent authoritarianism and great conflict. Sounds great, but here we are now living under increasing authority.
Yeah, and skepticism is ultimately a dead end, not just politically, but just personally. If you reject reason as a means of acquiring knowledge and thinking and living and dealing with reality and living life, you're not going to last very long. And politically, if a culture rejects reason, you're ultimately going to get destruction. Now, a culture will only tolerate skepticism and subjectivism to a point, in which case they might turn to reason, which is great, or they might turn to mysticism, which ultimately leads you to authoritarianism, which is bad, but people tend to prefer authoritarianism to chaos. And this is, again, something that Leonard Peikoff talks about in his book, The Dim Hypothesis. Dim, D-I-M, representing the three prevailing modes of integration in the West. D being disintegration through skepticism and the tradition of Immanuel Kant. I being integration through reason in the tradition of Aristotle. And M being misintegration via mysticism, via Plato. And politically, after disintegration results in destruction and chaos, the mystics will ultimately cash in and take over. People will turn to authoritarianism, likely to a form of religion, which, Christianity is ultimately a form of Platonic mysticism. And right here we see a conservative, John Doyle, presenting mysticism as the only alternative to disintegration.
People occurs through family, through community, through church, through nation, etc. This is the backbone of every healthy society. Collectivism is different because the unity is enforced by the state as a response to the society destabilizing and coming apart. Because once you can strip people of all identity, everything that could have unified them, not only does the society...
And look at these pictures. Given that he keeps talking about the left and commies and that this is footage from Portland, I'm going to guess that this is Antifa. Earlier, he mentioned that if you looked outside, everything is burning. And is that what these people are rioting for? Is that why they're destroying? Is that why they're burning everything down? Are Antifa rioters, are they rioting on behalf of radical individualism? Of course they're not.
Society become a tinderbox of people who have nothing in common and who don't trust each other. But once the collective identity becomes having no identity, then the herd will preserve that anti-identity by going against anybody who tries to conserve an identity through collectivism, because that identity will go against the only thing that they have left to identify with, which is their worship of the state. That is the timeline, and that's what has happened here.
The problem here is that individualism requires identity. You exist, so you have identity. Now, one could say that maybe Mr. Doyle has a point in that a lot of the destroyers like Antifa and these anarchist rioters ultimately have to fall back on some form of statism. That's why often you might see a hammer and sickle flag at some of these Antifa riots. Ayn Rand talks about the tribal lone wolf in her essay Selfishness Without a Self, about how the tribal lone wolf lacks identity because they turn off their mind, they shut off their brain, and they act on momentary whims rather than any rational personal desire. These are people who think that reality is one big conspiracy against them, which I think describes a lot of today's Antifa and anarchist rioters. But also says that people will wrongfully try to package this, will wrongfully hold up these rioters, these destroyers, and these tribal lone wolves as the embodiment of selfishness. I think where Mr. Doyle obviously goes wrong is by saying that the real problem here is individualism. The real problem is the rejection of individualism and rational thought.
We went from organic unity to individualism to collectivism, because it turns out that having nothing in common with anybody, being the only thing everyone has in common, is not a sustainable model for a society. And so collectivism and big government can be understood correctly as basically adding columns and buttresses to this whole setup to keep it from imploding on itself like a collapsing star. The system is unsustainable, and they know that. And so we enter the managed decline phase of things to try to minimize the blast radius of the inevitable collapse. But the scary part is that the people managing the decline are far less intelligent and capable than the people who orchestrated the decline in the first place. So we'll see what happens, I suppose. Just a matter of time. Man versus time. Isn't that always it? Man wrestling with the reality of his own impermanence. You know, back in healthy times, man would dedicate his life to the pursuit of something greater than himself. God, family, nation, etc.
Yeah, dedicate your life to something greater than yourself, like God and family and nation.
That is how he conquered time. He would elevate himself towards a greater purpose.
Although it is rational, you know, if you start a family, to take care of your family.
Purpose to achieve this like quasi-eternal state, whether that's through eternal salvation or being revered by your descendants for having achieved greatness for your people. What happens, though, when you strip away all identity? How does man conquer time? How does he transcend it? He does so by pretending that it doesn't exist. He overcomes time by simply distracting himself from it with endless media and entertainment. Ask him.
I would say a rational man deals with time. They use time as a measurement, as a reminder that life is finite, and they dedicate their life to maybe enjoying life, maybe find ways to prolong life, which one does through reason and productivity. But apparently the answer is religion, particularly a religion that essentially says that, you know, this life and time here on earth is a waste and that your focus should be the afterlife.
That's just not smart.
Man to tell you about himself in healthy times. He says he's a Christian, he's a father, he's a son, he's a proud citizen of whatever nation. Ask a man the same question now. He's far more likely to tell you about his favorite Netflix shows and fast food chains. That's what liberalism does. That's what individualism does. It reduces identity to that which can be commercialized. This is the concept of the graphic t-shirt. This is a new phenomenon in human history. This is what media I like. I wear it on my clothing as a flag to others who might identify with this as well. This is who I am. And this has highlighted the two types of people we have.
Yeah, so individualism, it reduces identity to which that can be commercialized. And it's all about, you know, selling t-shirts. Look at this. Look at this. Selling t-shirts, Yeah, look at this. Oh yeah, earlier in the video, he tries to sell t-shirts. I mean, isn't he kind of selling an identity here? Isn't he trying to commercialize an identity? Anyway, jumping back.
There are two categories that people fall into now. Those who prioritize self-expression against those who prioritize self-dedication. The people who simply want to dedicate their lives to something greater than themselves against the people who will stop at nothing to be able to express themselves in any way that they like, whether it's parades, it's public sex, it's redefining gender, it's having the audacity to criticize the great literature of our civilization, to criticize their own ancestors. It's all of it. It's narcissism versus selflessness.
Narcissism versus selflessness.
It's left versus right.
It's left versus right. Now, so narcissism is the left, selflessness is the right. That's what makes the right good. Now, narcissism is often a package deal. A package deals selfishness with second-handedness. Selfish people, I would say that selfish people are people of the mind, people who seek to achieve through reason and productive effort. Selfish people, they seek happiness. They seek self-esteem in this life while recognizing and respecting the rights of other people, whereas second-handers, they ultimately seek the praise of others. They emphasize the opinions of others. Maybe they sometimes seek material gain or prestigious gain by destroying others, which is ultimately destructive and will never bring about happiness or self-esteem, which you could argue is prevalent amongst many of the crazies on the left. Often when talking politics, discussing whether or not a destroyer like a Bolshevik Bernie Sanders, like an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like a Lenin, like a Stalin, maybe a Greta No Thunberg, you know, discussing whether or not these people are genuine believers in altruism and collectivism, or if they're just a narcissist using altruism as a moral cover for their destruction. It's kind of a chicken and egg question. Sometimes it's hard to tell, but they're definitely holding up altruism selflessness as their moral ideal, and they're definitely not individualists. But that's the left, according to John Doyle, narcissism, and you can't know reality. Morality is subjective, and now they're burning the place down. So what's the alternative we're presented? What's the alternative we're presented by the right? We're presented with a primitive form of philosophy that says you can only know reality through a non-rational means, and that the moral standard is either following some orders from a higher power or the selfless concern for others. And I guess we need the reason why we need individual rights is so that you can turn off your mind, go to church, and get told how to sacrifice for others.
That's just not smart.